Q&A after the film with producer Julie Anderson. So take it away, Sasha.
How's everybody feeling? Mic's not working. Still needs. Right here? Oh, it's working. Cool.
You guys hear him?
Yeah. Thanks for coming out. Thanks to the IDA. This is really a fancy opportunity for us. We're very thankful to be here. And we made a film about a great American. And you know, oftentimes when it comes to us, when I say us, people who look like me, we're not really considered Americans. We're considered other. We're considered African Americans, which I'm proud to be. But we're Americans, and Louis Armstrong was a great American. Despite the way America treated him, he still represented day in and day out. And I think you'll learn something about him that you didn't know before. And I think he should finally have his Basquiat moment. The guy was a real Renaissance man. He's a fine artist, writer, musician, singer. You name it, Louis Armstrong did it. And we can talk about it afterwards if you stick around. Thanks for coming out.
The talented creators who put it together, Sacha Jenkins. Okay. So congratulations, you two. You know, so what inspired this? What was your motivation to tell Satchmo's story?
Nice people at Imagine Entertainment reached out to me and asked me if I'd be interested. And I did a little research and I said, how could I not want to do this?
Why did you say yes?
Because I went into Louis Armstrong thinking one thing, and then when I learned, I realized that my initial impression was wrong about who he was and what he was about.
You know, like journalism, a big part of filmmaking is discovery. I mean, what did you discover about the man once you really got underneath the surface of who he was?
Well, as someone who came up with hip-hop and Public Enemy, you know, what I knew of Louis Armstrong just didn't jive with the consciousness that I was looking for in my teens. And when I learned that obviously he's a man of his time, you have to consider where he's been and where he's come from and what it took to become who he became. And, you know, here's a man with a 5th grade or pretty much no formal education who's a prolific writer, fine artist, singer, you know, play his instrument like no other, and was able to make his way in America then. Even now it would be tough. I mean, who can you name now in the modern context who's Louis Armstrong? He's funny. He's got good style. I mean, who's got all of that in one package? I've never seen anyone like him. And I didn't know that.
Julie, how about you? What brought you on board?
Well, very much like Sacha, the amazing team at Imagine Documentary Films put us together. We actually hadn't even met before, but for me to be, you know, asked to produce a film about Louis Armstrong was a great honor for me. I mean, he's a tremendous musician, a tremendous ambassador for humanity in general. And I, like Sacha, knew a certain amount about Louis, but when we were given access to the archive, there's an amazing archive at the Louis Armstrong Foundation. As you see in the film, he starts recording just meetings with friends, parties, just anytime he's got people around him who want to talk. And we got to see a side of Louis that not many people were able to experience. And to bring that to the audiences was just such a thrill for all of us.
So he had the understanding that his story was important.
Well, very much so. I mean, even from the beginning. And as Sacha said, he was such a prolific writer. There are hundreds of letters. His letters would go on for 10 or more pages. He would spend a lot of his time when he was traveling writing, and then he later got the typewriter. But yes, a man of humanity that just wanted to reach everybody. No matter how important you were to how unimportant you were, everybody was the same to Louis.
Talk about the research. Talk about bringing it all together. I mean, how long did it take you from the time that you signed up to finished product?
Oh, 2 years, right? I mean, it takes a village, and Julie's one of the chiefs. And we just had a crazy village of people who really were dedicated to this thing like no other. I mean, I've never seen anything like it. Like, people took great pride in the work. And there's like 60 years of archival with the man who is the most famous man in the world for many years. So there's a lot to comb through, a lot of places to dig, dusty places that smell funky.
Yeah, there's lots of archival footage. So, I mean, how did you begin to do the research, the organization, to know what part, I mean, he lived to be in his 70s, what part of his story, you know, that you would ultimately tell?
Well, myself and Jason Pollard, the editor, have a shorthand. We work together a bunch, and we really talk about things that are important, things that you want to know about Louis Armstrong. You know, one criticism was that there wasn't enough musicology, and my rap has become, well, in order to understand his music, you got to understand the man. So, you know, everything from the fact that he's into laxatives, you know, that's part of the man. The guy was really into weed, you know, at a time when it was a bad thing, and he said it was better for you, and look where we are now. Look at your man Biden, you know, people out. So, all of these things, just coming to a consensus on the general ideas that really formulate who he was. And, you know, Julie will tell you, so many things get lost, too. You can't fit it all in the amount of time we had, so we had to make tough decisions.
Impossible, really. I mean, there's always going to be stuff you would like to have in the film that's not there. But what we started with a group discussion about themes. Like, what were the themes we wanted to include in broad strokes? Patriotism, humanity, of course, music. Pot was even a theme, and it was almost like a word cloud that we created together online because we all started remotely working during COVID.
And when you think about the enormity of his celebrity, I mean, it transcends, you know, his art. I mean, there are buildings named after, you know, Louis Armstrong. And there are not too many artists that you can actually say that about. I mean, ultimately, what do you think it is that allowed him to touch people's heart in such a way that, you know, that you would name buildings and enshrine him in a way that is normally not associated with musicians?
I think he was just pure, and I think it was very relatable, and people were taken aback by how honest and how pure he was. I mean, when he's on TV and he tells the story of the guy who gave him the advice that when you go up north, you need, you know, one white man to say, "You're my N-word." You don't see that Tony Randall of Odd Couple fame is sitting next to him wincing like, "Oh my God, how can you say that?" But he knew exactly what he was saying. What he was saying was, you all put me in this position. This is how I had to navigate. This is what I had to do. And the question becomes, well, he said the person who told him that, gave him that advice, wasn't the most elegant person, right? So he's acknowledging that it's not elegant language, or this person's not elegant. But he's taking this advice very seriously. And the question becomes, was Louis Armstrong wrong?
So, and, you know, and he got in trouble. I mean, he clearly, you know, from members of the black community, had a hard time reconciling what was perceived by many to be, you know, an extension of step infection, or of being, of adopting a character or characteristics that weren't in keeping with what African American people wanted to be associated with. But what you're saying, in fact, is that he was being his authentic self.
That's what Miles Davis says in the film.
Okay.
He says he's, you know, when he's the guy you see is who he is with his friends. This is who he really is. So then he's that way in front of his friends, but then when he's that way in front of white people, then all of a sudden he's an Uncle Tom.
Mm-hmm.
Is he an Uncle Tom if he's just doing it with black people?
Now, what about the comments that Ozzy made, where he said that there was, you know, another element there that instead how some might go into the streets or express it differently, he funneled it through the music, through the horn.
Yeah, I mean, I think he came to realize that Lewis was his father and his uncle and himself.
Mm-hmm.
It helped him realize that, sure, they're generations apart, and different generations see things differently, and I can understand why his generation felt the way they did, and why I felt the way I did in my generation as an extension of what they were about. But he came to realize, hey, this guy's from a different time. God knows what he's been through, because I know that my father and my uncle have stories. So why is he any different? Why should I feel funny about him?
Lewis was a bridge in many ways because he was the only black entertainer who was playing for 100% white audiences all over the world. And yet that wasn't necessarily his choice. He would play in front of anybody, and he loved playing in front of his own people. As he said, like, the black people couldn't even get in to see him in New Orleans. They had to sit on the levee outside, you know, and that bothered him. And yet that's what he had to do, and he understood that. You know, the 50s was such a different time. I mean, you listen to the stories of his travels and what he had to put up with, but he never complained about that. He just kept working and working and working, and that's how he became who he was.
Excuse me. What do you want the takeaways to be for the audience? How do you want, what should the dialogue post, viewing be as you're having coffee and discussing what you just saw?
And it's a portrait of an extraordinary man who was just a man with extraordinary gifts, but still had to deal with America. Still found patriotism at a time when, he and his people were being oppressed, and still found a way to find pride and put all that he had into his art in spite of that. I think that's an inspirational story. I think it's, especially in the times we're in now, it's like everything that's in this film is now. It's like it's now, what's different? And he's dealing with this 60, 70, a long time ago, but we're still dealing with it now.
Was there any interaction with the family or family members as you began to make the project?
It's the foundation, really, the Louis Armstrong Foundation. He didn't have any children. Lucille died 10 or 15 years after Louis did, but they started the foundation while Louis was still alive. I think they started with just $40,000, but they wanted to really document Louis's life and his experiences, and they started the foundation long before Louis passed away, and they always wanted his life to be remembered and all the things that he went through. And he had 116 scrapbooks.
Wow.
He documented his life, religiously, in a sense. And so I think that these conversations that get started after seeing this film are really fascinating, because I think people see a very unvarnished picture of what it's like to be a black man in a white world, and yet they see a true humanitarian who really loves so many different kinds of people. I mean, honestly, the scene in the dressing room with all the different people in the dressing room, that's what he was like. He welcomed everybody into his life.
Why don't we open it up to questions from the audience?
I love the film. It was very eye-opening, beautiful. Can you talk a little bit about the decision to do the collage and clippings as part of the format of the documentary?
Yeah, I mean, I was just a fan of his art. I was blown away by it, didn't know that he did it, and I felt like it was such a personal look at who he was. So to find a way to mimic it in the film, I felt was a way to get you even closer to understanding who the guy was and how he thought, how he put all these things together and was innovative. And the artist who did it, this guy Hector Arias, he does something for all my films. He's just a one-man Dominican party who can do it all, and he's a brilliant individual.
It gave us a real opportunity to bring a visual sense to Louis's stories, for which there was no archival material, and really bring them to life in a way that if we had just used still photos or headlines or something like that, it would have not been the same sort of magical feeling you get from what Heck has created. We were just blown away by Heck's work every single time he sent something new to us.
It's almost like mini music videos inside the film.
Sir?
I was curious if you were ever tempted to make it into a multi-part documentary, as been done with so many people. And one person that I missed in the documentary that I was hoping to see more of was Ella Fitzgerald and developing how that relationship evolved.
Well, that's a question that we get, couldn't this be 15 parts? The answer is we're the wrong people to ask. You got to talk to the white people who cut the checks. But,
That's keeping it real.
well, yeah, the Beatles get 9 episodes, right? Not that the Beatles aren't great. I love them.
Frank Sinatra had 7 hours.
Right. Louis Armstrong gets, almost 2, which is cool. We made it work, and hopefully maybe someone else can step up and do 4 more episodes. But we worked with what we had, and I think what's great about Apple is they're very supportive of this film, and they're really behind it and pushing it and very proud of it. So we're proud to work with them and very thankful for the opportunity to do that.
Another question, sir?
I don't really have a question. I just want to thank you for what you did. So I grew up on his jazz. I was a jazz musician, and he was a hero. And I know that this was an untold story that generations today need to know. And I can't thank you enough for what you've done.
Well, my pleasure. And I think what's great about it is, like for instance, the narrator was a rapper named Nas, who was here. He left after the film. Yet he hadn't seen it, he really liked it. But it's such a contemporary, like I said, it's what's his stories now. Nothing's changed. So I think when other folks, younger generations, other people see this film, they're going to see themselves. America can see itself. He was trying to get America to live up to the brochure that America's been putting out for years about, pull your pants up and you can do anything you want. And he lived up to that for sure. But America didn't keep its end of the bargain. And we're still dealing with trying to figure out the bargain or the discount or whatever it is.
He had the wisdom to know that music is a universal language, and he created a brand new language of music. And he's one of the greatest people of the 20th century, and probably the most unsung.
Yeah, and when Imagine called me, I didn't know. So like you said, you make these movies and you learn. It's journalism, and I was knocked out by the journalism.
The discovery of
Unbelievable.
someone being something totally different than who you may have thought at first.
Yep.
Any other questions? Sir, ma'am?
Yeah, thank you again for this movie. I'm one of those people who grew up in the 60s and had a hard time reconciling Louis' stage persona with his spiritual persona. I'm a musician, so I always had deep respect for his music. But I heard him say once, he was asked, why you always smiling at people? And he said, I smile at people because I love what I do. I love my music. And I love to make people smile, and I love to see them smile, and I love smiling back at them. And it kind of flipped the switch for me because I realized his spiritual persona was just really transcendent. And so what we saw on the political side, or with the image of him, was not really who he was in his depth. So thank you for making this movie and bringing that to life. A couple of quick questions. I wanted to find out, did you consider reaching out? You did have a daughter. Did you consider reaching out to his daughter? And then 2, what was your take on his actual relationship with Joe Glaser? Was it a partnership? Was it an exploitative relationship? What is your sense of your research?
Well, to answer the first part of your question, the woman who may or may not be Louis's daughter, she will not take a DNA test. She has refused to take a DNA test. However, her mother was a friend slash perhaps a girlfriend, and Louis did support them. He gave them money. There are letters documenting that, but whether or not she is really his daughter, we don't know that. And in fact, there is a story about whether or not at the Waifs home, the young boys were castrated at the Waifs home, part of the eugenics of that time. And the fact that Louis had 4 wives and loved children and didn't have any children makes you really want to question that part. So I think the answer is we don't know. We don't know. But he did also say that they nearly adopted a child when they were in Africa, but they didn't have enough time. Do you want to answer the second
And
question?
he was very tender and loving, and he loved Lucille, but let's keep it a buck. He had multiple liaisons on the road. And even Lucille was like, come on, we know that you're doing your thing and you don't have any kids. She had to cut the check sometimes, so she knew, but no one really fully believed. But who am I to say that that wasn't her dad? But that revelation came along when we were almost done with the film. What was the other question? Glazer.
Yes.
I mean, he traded one gangster for another, but okay. The N-word is used a few different ways in the film. I don't know if you picked up on that. And his, black friends referred to him as an N-word with an A. So, they said that he grew up with blacks, they loved blacks, that Joe Glazer was responsible for his success. So, it's the music business, it's dirty, but they had no contract and they were friends, and supposedly Louis died with a lot of money and Glazer died with money that was, comparable to what his job was. So, seemingly, there was a positive relationship.
Yeah, in fact, Ricky Riccardi, who's the scholar and who is the curator of all things Louis Armstrong, said that they died with nearly the same amount of money in the bank. And Glazer died just months before Louis did.
They're in the hospital together.
Yeah. And he managed a lot of other people, too. He didn't just manage Armstrong. He was making money with other artists as well. Billie Holiday.
It sort of takes us back to one of the questions. You have 2 hours, so how do you decide what you're going to put in that in that space? And so obviously this is something that simply you determined not to include.
Well, it's sort of like, it's a little like sending out a rumor that we don't even know it's true. So I don't think it was something we would have felt comfortable bringing up without a little bit more documentation. I think it would have been a little irresponsible for us to throw that out. It would have taken away from many other things, yes.
Yeah, I mean, I think humor is important. He was serious about laxatives, but it's kind of funny. I thought it was funny.
Next question. In the back.
Dope film, by the way, Sacha, is what we kind of expect
Talk louder.
these days. But you went away from Talking Heads, which was a really interesting choice. Picked up on, kind of just used the voiceover. Why that choice? I mean, it definitely worked. Just curious.
We had the man himself. A lot of the folks who knew him well are no longer here.
Yeah.
Dan Morgenstern, who's a journalist, is one contemporary interview that we did. He knew him. He's like 94, right? So he's one voice, and Winton is contemporary. You got to have a couple of folks from now, but how can you break that up with modern people talking when you've got the man himself who can tell you how he feels? I mean, I feel like I've been telling people, I think he co-directed the film. There's that scene at the very end with the last record that he played before he died. That record and that turntable was the actual physical record that he played before he died and the actual turntable. Those reel-to-reel tapes that you saw, we had to get them operated on to get them to work again. Turntable, we couldn't get to work, so we were going to spin the record manually and shoot it. We couldn't even find where the plug is, right? Don't you know that the turntable started to work? and no one knew where the source of electricity was coming from. So, the guy, I believe in my heart, I'm not lying, he co-directed the film. He left all the material behind. He said, here's everything. Scrapbooks, me talking shit, great performances, my second wife, telling me what to do and me listening to her. That's the other thing. It's like he had women in his life that he listened to. He told them to man up, and he did. What if he didn't listen to Lucille and to stay with Mr. Joe? Because he sent for him, you know what I mean? It's like, this guy was really advanced.
The other thing is that we found an archive of oral histories that was recorded by the National Endowment for the Arts in the 70s. And so Sacha only wanted people who had played or known Lewis at that time. So all of those interviews from musicians from the past were people who had real experiences with Lewis. So we didn't really have anyone talking about a Lewis that they didn't know. So all those interviews were people who had either played with him, traveled with him. So those are very real stories from the heart. And that was just fantastic discovery. It just gave the film a whole new dimension of people who knew Lewis talking about Lewis.
Any more questions?
I just have a quick.
Sure.
Love the film, fantastic. Where did that Ozzie Davis clip come? What is that from? It seemed like it was a performance or something.
Yeah, so Ozzie and Ruby had their own television show, I think, back in the 70s. And it was done by a PBS station somewhere in the Midwest. And that's a clip from their show. And we had an amazing archival producer, Amilka Palmer, who found that clip. And we were, it speaks volumes about what we were trying to say, that Ozzie said. And so, such a really well delivered idea and story of describing Lewis and his needing to cross two worlds and putting up with being perceived as one thing or another.
Now, besides the alleged daughter and manager, were there any other parts of his life that you wanted to include or just didn't have the space, the time to keep in?
Well, there's some murky waters with, him being an ambassador, traveling places on behalf of the United States, and like the United States' real agenda and what the United States was doing behind the scenes, what the CIA might have been doing behind the scenes, and sort of him being involved in things, not fully understanding what's happening, and then maybe later realizing and feeling like a pawn. I mean, that's a whole film in and of itself.
Yeah, that might get us to the 7 hours.
Yeah.
Any final thoughts, sir?
Love the comments about you feel like Louis co-directed the film and that story. If he were here watching the film, what do you think how do you think he'd respond to it? Do you think he would want 7 hours like the Beatles, or do you think that he'd be happy with, I love it. I think it's really just so memorable and concise.
It's just enough.
What do you think Louis would say?
I think that he would say that people know him now. You can walk away saying, I have a feeling because by the time you get to the end of the film, it's actually kind of sad. I mean, he's going to die. But I get kind of sad at the end, because it's like you spent time with this guy, you got to know him, you hang out with him, you laugh at his jokes, funny guy. He's sad, but you know him. That's why it feels effective, because after spending this time with him, you feel like you know this guy, you've invested in him, you love his music, or now you love it, and you're learning about it, and now that you know more about him, you might invest more in the music, but you know him, so I think he'd say, people got to know me a little bit better, much better than anything that's out now. We don't know anything about the guy.
Well, I think I'll hear his music differently now. So thank you, great film.
Oh, okay. You.
But can you please talk a little bit more about his trip to, was it Ghana or Africa? Was that prompted by that performance there, or were there other reasons that you know about why he went there and what kind of impact that trip had on him?
Seemed like it was you and something that he.
Yeah, you know, he was there as an ambassador, as a cultural ambassador. He always wanted to go to Africa, and this is another interesting thing because America is this place where, you know, the idea of anything African is savage and negative, and here's this, you know, black celebrity who's saying he's proud to go to Africa. He sees a woman who looks like his mom. I mean, not many people were saying stuff like that. Black people were not saying stuff like that in the 50s. So, you know, he was there as an ambassador. And, you know, on behalf of the United States government, I'm pretty sure.
Well, the second trip that we took out, there was a second trip
Right.
to
Ivory Coast.
which was in the middle of it was in the middle of the revolution, where he was sent by the American government to the government meant jazz ambassadors to spread democracy during a time when in the 50s, when the United States felt like the whole world was going to fall to communism. So they're sort of like propping up how great democracy was by utilizing these jazz ambassadors to go and play jazz, which was an American, you know, creation, and this will tell us how great America is. And that's why people like Lewis, where he says on the tarmac they were going to send him to Russia, and he said, if I go and they ask me about what's going on in Little Rock, I'm going to tell them the truth. That's why maybe they shouldn't send me right now, because I'm going to tell them what's happening here.
And the prime minister in Ghana was the prime minister at the time of Ghana's independence. So maybe there was some sort of messaging, you know, associated with that. So, an amazing catalog of songs. Now that you've, you know, spent all of this time with him and have a better understanding of both the man and his artistry, what's your favorite Louis Armstrong?
Well, my favorite song was always What a Wonderful World, but what I learned was the older music, like the Hot Five and the early stuff that we heard. I play that all the time now.
Okay.
And I had never listened to that earlier music, but I learned an appreciation for it, like the story about the solos and the high Cs. And he was the first jazz soloist. Prior to that, jazz had just been played as a band, as a group. So when I learned more about that early music, I became a much bigger fan of that music as well.
For me, Cold Card Blues, which is in the film, now that I know more about him and the stories behind it, it just feels, I can see him singing it, you know, and really feeling it, meaning it having meaning to him.
And I just want to say one more thing about Terence Blanchard, who did who was the composer of the film, is when Terence got on the phone with Sacha and I, the first thing he said was, I'm not playing any trumpet, no trumpet. He said, I'm not going to play trumpet against Lewis. And so all of the composed music it's just piano, strings, no horns. And that was something very respectful that Terence, you know, he's a trumpeter of, you know, considerable talent, and didn't want to play trumpet against Lewis, but actually came up with a score that's just stunning.
Now that you seek him out because he is from New Orleans, from Louisiana? Okay.
And Terence loved Lewis.
Right.
He said, I have to do this, guys.
Right. I mean, it's just amazing, you know, the airport where the U.S. Open is played. I mean, his legacy has moved so far beyond music. So, you know, thank you for this opportunity, you know, for us to learn more about who he was and to sort of get underneath the surface of that, of what we've seen. But, you know, it's just this. It just gives you a greater sense and a greater understanding of what, you know, who the man was. So thank you so much.
Thank you.